Okay. All right. Are we ready to go? And this switched up, or no? Oh, okay. All right. Well, good morning again. I'd like to briefly reintroduce our panel members here. I've been looking forward to this conversation. When I arranged for Father Dominic to join us, I thought that we're getting an echo here. Okay, is it still echoing? Oh, I don't hear it now.
It's not working.
Oh,
No, it's not working at all.
we're all right now? Okay, terrific. Every time we have computer-related IT issues, I always think of the old slideshows, and there was always a slide upside down, and it would stop everything while we had to rearrange them. And we're supposed to not have this problem anymore, and yet our idea this morning was to have a discussion on spirituality. Spirituality being an increasing interest, particularly here at Reedwood Friends. And the opportunity to have Father Dominic with us was just too great an opportunity to pass by in terms of the opportunity to discuss his experience with Ignatian spirituality, the form of spirituality that the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola, thus the Loyola, of course, of all the different Jesuit universities, including my own, and his form of spirituality, comparing that with, of course, the development of Quaker spirituality. So we have two fine panelists here. Our own Carole Spencer, who, of course, has taught in Quaker studies, has a particular interest in Quaker women. History of Quaker women is published in that area, and has taught both here and in Indiana.
Yeah, Earl.
That's right, at Earlham. And of course, Father Dominic is presently on the faculty of the Pontifical Institute of Biblical Studies in Rome. And so he, in how many days, will be flying back to Rome? Okay, shall we all try and hitch a ride? And so our discussion today is to compare Quaker and Ignatian spirituality. So here's a way to get us started. If you were asked to quickly summarize some of the highlights of spirituality for you, Carole, in the Quaker tradition, Dominic in the Ignatian tradition, if somebody just said, well, what is Ignatian spirituality? And you only had a few minutes, what would be some of the highlights that you would hit? Let's start with you.
So the young one gets the opportunity. Here is an accomplished spirituality expert, but then I myself should start with a disclaimer. These days, people come to Italy and then they fall in love with gelato. Okay. Now there are two ways to enjoy gelato. You go to a gelateria, order one, just relish it. The other one is you buy a recipe book, learn for yourself, start from the scratch, make one and enjoy it. I am the first type. When I joined the society, I did Ignatian spirituality without knowing it, because that is how I was trained. Later on, only I learned what it is. So if somebody asked me, and then that somebody gives me just 2 minutes, let us say, what would I say? I would say counter-cultural. Ignatian spirituality is its beginning and continuation, and even today, tries to be countercultural. And if an explanation is needed, simply put, during the time of Ignatius, what happened was people felt if one has to be spiritual, one needed to be away from the world. So monasticism, for example. So you go away from the world and then to be deeply immersed in spiritual life. When he proposed that one, it just was a revolution because he said that the spirituality has to be right in the world, definitely not of the world. And it was a kind of a revolution within the church.
Well, that's interesting that you said countercultural. That wasn't one that I had thought about as a characteristic of Quaker spirituality, but actually it is very characteristic of Quaker spirituality. Quakers were kind of like monks in the world. They they were somewhat ascetical, like the monastics, but they were out in the world. Their vocation was in the world. So in that way, there's a similarity, I think, of both types of spirituality. If someone asked me, what are the 5 basic characteristics of Quaker spirituality, I would say primarily it is an experiential faith. It's about one's experience, direct experience. And in that sense, it is a kind of mystical faith because mysticism is really knowledge through direct experience of God. So it is kind of a mystical faith, which I guess Ignatian was a mystic as well as George Fox. Both of them, our founders, were mystics. And secondly, I would say that it's the emphasis on the light within, that we all have that light within us. So that gives everyone access to God directly. That's why it's experiential faith, because we have this light within. And that is the primary characteristic of Quaker spirituality. That also means that everyone is equal. So equality is a very high value in Quaker spirituality, which is why I've always been interested in the history of women in Quakerism, because they were ministers from the very beginning. So we have this sense of all our ministers. We don't have like a clergy class. So that would separate us from the Jesuits. Thirdly, I would say silence, the appreciation and value of silence, that we have silence in our worship. Some Quakers have totally a silent worship. We also have preaching and singing, but we also value the silence as group silence as well as kind of individual contemplative practices. So I think of Quakers as contemplatives in action, which is also another way to think of the Jesuits. They also are kind of contemplatives, but with a lot of social concern, social witness, interest in promoting peaceful practices, nonviolence, witness to oppression, helping mediation rather than joining the military. We would try to do mediation work instead. So I guess we could sum up Quaker spirituality with the spices, which we're all familiar with the spices now because we have this wonderful display of our spices with photographs in our hallways. So that would be simplicity, the practice of simplicity, the practice of peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. So that's a good way to kind of summarize Quaker spirituality.
Thank you. Dominic, maybe not for you personally, but in your observation of when Jesuits joined the order, and then they're asked to undergo some of these spiritual practices, which of those spiritual practices in the Jesuit tradition have you observed that people are the most surprised about, or even perhaps even have some difficulty with, and which are the ones that they just tend to are drawn towards and always say, oh, I loved that part. So what was the part that surprised them? What was the part that they tended to love?
Daniel, although you did not want me to be personal, can I be a little personal here? The most surprising thing, or perhaps a shocking thing for me when I joined the society, was how much of the focus of what Ignatius would typically call helping the souls. That's kind of his mantra and the kind of formula for his ministry. This, I learned it in a kind of indirect way. So I'm coming from India, and India, what you eat defines where you belong in the social ladder. So the Brahmins who are right on top of the caste system are pure vegetarians. As you keep going down, then other meat items come in. People who eat pork are considered to be the untouchables, outcasts. And I come to the society, I entered the Jesuits, and I am there for the training. And my master, as we call him, the one who trains us, he saw me because I'm coming from a family, we never had beef or pork. Because in that caste group, it is unthinkable. And if you say that you are eating that one, even your own family will feel, are you doing that one, kind of thing. So my master has observed me that whenever beef or pork was served, I was just slowly going to the corner and then getting my veggies and then eating. He didn't call me to challenge me. Rather, he asked me to come and meet him. I met him, and then he asked me, Dominic, I noticed that you don't take beef or pork. Is there any diet restriction? I said, no. The moment he realized that there was no diet restriction, he understood immediately it has to do with the sociological factors. Then he said, every week, Wednesday, we go to the villages to be with the people. And these are all Dalit people, the outcasts and the untouchable people. And he asked me, so you go with your companion to the village for your ministry, weekend ministry. And then when you go there, typically people offer you food, isn't it? I said, yes. What do they offer you? For Dalit community, to honor a guest, they typically offer you the dry beef. So what do? I politely tell them that I don't eat beef. And what do you think that communicates to them? And he said, would you be willing to experiment at least? Just sit with me and I'll tell you how to eat just a piece of beef. Take a little bit of rice, put a piece, and then cover it with another bit more of rice and taste it. How do you like it? I didn't feel any big difference between that and the goat meat, which is permitted in our community. I said, this is okay. Then he began to reason out with me, saying that when you go to a family and they're offering you food, and then you receive it as a way of being part of the family. And the moment you say no, what happens is you are putting yourself above them. And if your gospel message has to be reached, you want to share the gospel message, not merely words. These small gestures matter. I said, wow. And then later on, I learned that during the spiritual exercises, which is what you're saying about, everyone has to go through the spiritual exercises. One of them is what is called this ajre contra, going against some of the traits. For me, it was going against my own food habits, not because of just getting to know or getting to eat food, but what it serves in terms of the ministry. And what is not a great surprise is what just now we heard is the spiritual aspect of it. The silence aspect of it. Silence is so very significant for the Ignatian spirituality. In fact, I remember when the master told me that in the 1 month spiritual exercise, we will not speak, it was a shock for me. But for others, it is something that is not a big surprise, because when you come to spiritual life, silence is part and parcel of it. Yep.
Carole, when you have been with, in ecumenical context perhaps, or in contexts where people have come to Quaker meeting for the first time or the first few times, what has been your experience of what people say? Have they struggled with that, or what do you think?
A lot of people struggle with that. In fact, I will be honest, I struggled with at first when I went into a totally silent Quaker meeting when I was in England some years ago. And I had never sat in silence for a whole hour. It was really difficult. I am not a natural contemplative. I like to think of myself as a contemplative, but it's hard for me to silence my mind and to be open then to the movement of the Spirit. So I've had to gradually learn how to do that. And I love our, what we call our semi-program meeting, where we have preaching and then we have music, we have a variety of practices, but then we always, at the end, center in silence. And I've come to really appreciate that time for Quakers. But I think for the majority of people, silence is very hard. That's probably why Quakers are the only Protestant tradition that actually includes silence in their worship experience. And it's kind of unique to Quakers, though within the Catholic tradition, all the monks and, monastics, silence is a very important part of their tradition. So that is definitely something that has brought me into more dialogue with Catholics. And the other aspect that comes out of the silence is this idea that you are waiting for discernment. And discernment is huge in Quakerism, as it is in Ignatian spirituality, because Quakerism is based on experience, it's experiential faith. There's also the need for discernment. How is God leading you? So that kind of need guardrails from extremism, or people doing things out of their own egos or desires. So Quakers have developed over time discernment practices that we use in our open worship as well. And it's something that people have to be taught, because it doesn't really come naturally. And I think often people, when they're first enter into Quaker worship, they think it's maybe a time of testimony, or there's lots of different things that people do. But basically, in the silence, we are to open ourselves to listening to God, and if we're prompted then to speak a message that we feel is for everyone, then you stand and you speak that message, as we had examples in our meeting this morning from you and from Paul. So it's silence, but there's also speaking that comes out of the silence, and that's distinctively a Quaker practice, which is different than, say, a Buddhist contemplative practice, where it's totally silent. So that makes it a unique tradition. And it has taken me a while to learn how to be open to the Spirit and to know when I am being led or prompted to speak. And I don't speak a lot because I don't often feel certain that I'm being led to speak.
Thank you for that. Let's talk for a moment about change. Again, Dominic, as you see the members of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits today, and you're a little young for a question like this, but as you've seen change in terms of the emphasis of spirituality among younger Jesuits that you see coming in, do you see that there have been significant changes in Jesuit emphases of spirituality or practices, or is there a strong emphasis on staying with what Ignatius Loyola taught, or has there been some shift? And of course, I'll ask a similar question of Carole.
I want to say that starting with Ignatius, what happened was, during the initial years of forming the society, there was a key emphasis on the communal discernment. They discerned as a community, and exactly what Carole said about the Quaker, that we come together and then people express their opinions and then pray over it and then come back to rediscuss, and then until and unless we have as a group come to a kind of a consensus, prayer-informed, silence-induced consensus, we keep repeating that process, is something that the Jesuits did right at the beginning, because one of the things they wanted to do is to go to the Holy Land and do the ministry. That they felt that God is calling them to go to the Holy Land and do the ministry. But what happened was, for practical reasons and congregational rivalry, because at that time the Franciscans had the control of the Holy Land, and they didn't want to have another group coming over and then be a competition. So they unceremoniously sent off Ignatius. Okay, Ignatius was even threatened to be put in prison. So he comes back, And then they were forced to think. And this is where he meets his early companions and they begin to think. The context forces them to think. And they do want to start a congregation, but then what to do? And that is where they put themselves at the service of the Pope. And all those decisions came out because of the communal discernment. Later on, what happened was this individual discernment was kind of slipped in. Anybody who wants to join the society has to go through these 2 years of experience, intense prayers, and some ministry. During those 2 years, the major question the candidate is asking, and the one who is kind of guiding him is also helping him to ask that question is, does God call me? Is God calling me to be a Jesuit or not? So at the end of the second year, one decides to stay or just says, okay, I have tried, I came, saw, bye-bye, they go away. So the communal discernment began in a very powerful way at the beginning, but over the years, the individual discernment took over, and the cost of that one is individual discernment took center stage at the expense of communal discernment. And there is a Jesuit, Michael Sheehan. Oh, there you go.
Excellent book.
I just happened to read his fine article, and he says exactly that. Something that we have missed, a jewel in the spirituality, Ignatian spirituality, is we need to go back to this communal discernment. And where are we now? And that is where I say there is a sign of hope in what took place in the synod recently. In the synod, although it is conducted for the entire church, what they did was exactly this communal discernment, bringing back that original rich legacy where everyone who is sitting around the table has the opportunity to express his or her mind in a prayerful context. And the rest take efforts to listen in order to be informed before arriving at a decision. So are we there yet? I want to say no. This has to be kind of brought back very intentionally in order to at least make it on par with the individual's discernment. As we speak now, individual discernment is kind of the key focus.
Carole, how is Quaker spirituality, how have you seen changes or discerned changes in your study of that?
Well, my area is Quaker history, so I've looked at Quakers for the last over 300 years, and it has changed a lot. In fact, it started changing within the first generation from the very beginning. The earliest Quakers in like 1652, when Quakerism first began, they were very radical. They were very disruptive. They were considered subversive. And they taught that Christ could come and kind of be embodied within a person. And that was considered kind of a heretical belief. So they were considered heretics. And one thing that's kind of ironic and even a little humorous is that in this early 17th century, Quakers were called Jesuits in disguise. They actually were. And a lot of their opponents would write pamphlets against Quakers, calling them Pope Papist, and they were often lumped together with the Jesuits and the Franciscans because they were all considered heretics and subversive, all against the state church, the Anglican Church. And also because Quakers, the early Quakers were itinerants. They traveled around preaching the gospel, and that's what the Jesuits and the Franciscans could do as well. But of course, it was illegal to be Catholic back then, so you were, you could definitely be, killed for that. So I thought it's kind of interesting that at one time Quakers and Jesuits considered it part of the same kind of subversive group. So Quakerism has changed a lot. The theology has changed over time. It's gotten very diverse. We're probably the most diverse of all the Protestant traditions, in that we have fundamentalists, lots of evangelical Quakers, and we have very progressive Quakers, and we have Quakers who are Buddhist Quakers and who practice Zen, and I think some Jesuits do as well. So we've adopted kind of other traditions as well into our own tradition. I wanted to say something about Quaker discernment, because that's something that has changed over time as well. Quakers always practiced communal discernment, and the idea of direct individual discernment, like in spiritual direction, you don't find much about that in early Quakerism. There were certainly elders that would guide people, but they never would use the term spiritual direction. But now we offer courses at Quaker schools in spiritual direction because we borrowed that from the Jesuits, because they seem to be kind of the ones who have developed that, the rules for discernment in a way. Quakers never developed rules. In fact, they were very careful not to have rules. It was mostly something you just learned by intuition or practice. You didn't have a set of rules, whereas I think Ignatius actually wrote down rules, right? So, well, according to Sheeran, that Jesuits kind of recovered their communal discernment. Quakers, from the Quakers kind of have borrowed the spiritual direction from the Jesuits. So we've kind of interjected our own spiritualities into the other, which I think is a really valuable thing and a healthy thing. And it was so interesting that just last week, as you reminded me that I was going to do this panel, I get a text from Mark saying, I need a source for Quaker process, Quaker discernment. Can you give me a source for your footnote? And I said, oh, I've got the exact book, and I got this off of my library shelf. And I thought, oh, that's what we're going to be talking about on the panel. Here is probably the best book on Quaker process and discernment, and it's written by a Jesuit.
I remember the days when, right after Richard Foster wrote Celebration of Discipline, which he himself said was a revision and an updating of the spiritual disciplines. For basically Ignatius for Protestants. Right. Was, exactly. And I remember that there was a time there where it was extremely fashionable to be a Protestant who had a Catholic spiritual director. And if you were talking with each other and you said, oh, I have a spiritual director, and if you were and she's Catholic, and all the Protestants, ooh, like so there was very much this exchange, and this is a wonderful opportunity for me to mention to all of you that my dear wife is a trained spiritual director from the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange. So she's gone through the 2-year training program, and 3. Yeah, I forgot, that's right. And so it's interesting that we've borrowed spiritual disciplines back and forth across this interesting divide. It suddenly occurred to me when you mentioned that about Jesuits and Quakers, that if any of our Protestant brothers and sisters saw the program for today and saw that Father Dominic would be addressing a Quaker meeting, they were probably all going, I told you. So that's right. That's right. So the last question I wanted to ask before we just open up for general question is I guess getting a little bit more personal, and that is to ask you what aspect of the spiritual tradition, Dominic for the Jesuits, Carole for the Quakers, what have you found to be the most important for you in terms of your own faith and practice?
As part of the early training, one word that is drilled into our minds is the word magis. Just literally translated greater. So never be satisfied with what you do and what you are thinking now, whether in your thinking or doing or ministry, always aim for greater. And that greater doesn't stop with just greater, but for the greater glory of God. Are you doing all these things so that God is glorified more? This is as appealing as it is. There is a hidden cost to it. And I learned it in a kind of a hard way. I thought any work that is given to me, the more I do, the more glory I am bringing to God. Therefore, wherever I went, when ministry brought some requests to me, and it was the spontaneous Margis at the background tugging at me or pushing me to say yes. This is a way of glorifying God. But it goes only so far. In Biblicum in Rome, where doctoral students are so many and the licentiate students are so many, suddenly I found myself last year I'm surrounded by 20 theses to direct. And you know the joys of that. So 15 master's theses and 5 doctoral theses just left me energyless at the end of the day. I didn't have energy to write my own articles or my research work. So Margis, as attractive as it is, I went to the spiritual director and I told him, this is the challenge I'm facing now. And he said, probably your idea of Margis needs to be revised. Margis is not merely mechanically taking on many things, but how more productively you are involved in your ministry. For others, naturally, of course, helping the souls, but at the same time yourself. Do not exclude yourself from that group that you are ministering to. Is your ministry part of that ministry circle? So that is something really personal and something I learned a bit painful, but I learned it at the right time, I guess.
Well, I did not grow up as a Quaker, as a friend. I'm not a birthright Quaker, as they call those folks who are born into the Quaker faith, which I think you did, right? But I kind of discovered, although I was born and raised in Philadelphia, so I knew historically about Quakers, because when you're in high school, you learn Pennsylvania history, so you learn Quaker history. So I knew kind of a little historical background, but I didn't really know any Quakers, and I wasn't familiar with Quaker beliefs. And I was raised in kind of various Protestant, evangelical, mainline churches, so I had a pretty strong kind of a religious background. But in my probably 30s, I became kind of disillusioned with religion as a whole and the religion I was raised in. I moved to Oregon, and I met a Quaker woman who seemed like a very authentic person. And she said that she went to a Quaker church. Well, I had never heard of a Quaker church, because growing up in Philadelphia, they don't have Quaker churches. They're all meeting houses. So I thought that's unusual. And she invited me to visit, and I did. And I thought, well, they have a pastor, they preach, they sing. It seemed similar to the churches I was raised in. So I asked her to give me a book that would help me to understand kind of the history and the theology of Quakers. And she gave me a book called A Testament of Devotion by Thomas Kelly. I've shared this with many of you many, many times. And that book was transformative for me, because in his writing about Quaker spirit, and that is really a wonderful summary of Quaker spirituality. It was written in kind of the mid-1940s or so. And I was just amazed, number one, because of their social conscience, that Quakers had a social conscience. I didn't see that very much in churches I was raised in. And their belief in equality, that all men and women could be ministers, and it was non-hierarchical, non-patriarchal, ideally so, but it was. And that really spoke to me, because even before I became a Quaker, I was already a feminist. And I was already a pacifist too, because I kind of came of age during the Vietnam War, when there was a lot of protest against the war. And I was kind of involved, not personally a protester, but I thought Jesus really taught turn the other cheek, so it seems like that's true gospel message. So I was already kind of a Quaker before I became a Quaker, like you were kind of a Jesuit before you became a Jesuit. And it just really spoke to my condition, and that's what drew me into the Friends Church. So that's kind of my personal history.
Thank you. Thank you. Friends, let's open up. You have a wonderful Quaker scholar and a wonderful Jesuit scholar at your beck and call at this moment. So opportunity for you to raise questions. Paul?
Thanks. Great. Thank you so much, Brother Dominic and Carole and Daniel. Ignatius suffered injuries from war. And I've often wondered whether he could have come to the depth of prayer and spirituality if he weren't seeking God in the midst of his pain. And that leads me to think about Viktor Frankl and, transforming suffering into sacrifice, which allows for meaning to be involved in our lives. On a practical question, how do we, it's really easy to be joyful when things are going well, but in the suffering that we all experience, how can that be transformed into spiritual depth if we see it as an opportunity for prayer?
Thank you, Paul, for that very important, very profound question, because not merely when he was wounded and then he was lying on the bed, and then he had only those spiritual books to read, and then he said that if they can do it, I can also do. He is still a worldly man, even when he wanted to imitate the saints, because here is a man, just before this being wounded, a man who was totally worldly, who wanted to dress up well and then wanted to show himself as a manly person in order to be attractive, handsome, presentable. And then this knock comes, and then he is going through this conversion process. But the conversion process is quite long and painful. It's not that I want to become like the saints I would like to be, and then everything changed. No, he began to go to the other extreme of growing nails and all those things, and then very unpresentable. And then here is a person who took the spirituality to the other extreme. But then those experiences, and that is where his defining moment is when he's sitting on the bank of Cardinal River in Manresa, and there he gets that, what he describes as that vision, that light, that illumination, which puts things in perspective and tells him that neither extreme is not the way to go forward. But then in the pain, he has found God, and in pain, he will continue to find God. Even after becoming itinerant preacher and then well sought after spiritual director, what happens to him is repeated accusations against him and suffering. Even he physically suffered when he became the superior general. It was impossible for him because he has to write down the constitutions, but his physical ailment did not let him do that. He'll go up to the terrace and then look up the sky, and then he will see the stars and begin to tear up. And then he was crying so much that doctors even warned him that he might go blind. This is the person who went through suffering probably very frequently, and rightly so. The profound or the depth of his spirituality perhaps has a strong connection with that continued and continual suffering. I definitely feel so, yeah.
Carole, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thinking about suffering and the fact that Ignatius was a soldier reminded me that a lot of the early Quakers were soldiers as well. George Fox was not. He was asked to join the army, but he refused. But Quakerism arose at a time of this tumultuous civil war in England. And I think that there was a certain trauma in the experiences of the war and the suffering of that probably opened Quakers to meet with God, to hear God, that it was life-changing in that way. And so there is some parallels there between the war, Quakerism arising during a time of war, and Ignatius having been a soldier, and as his conversion happened while he was recuperating from his illness. And while George Fox never was, He actually was injured because he was persecuted so much and he was beaten up. But he also was a seeker, and he had went through a lot of emotional suffering trying to find a way to meet God because he wasn't finding it in the churches. So he talks about going to empty, desolate places, and he's very depressed, and it's in the midst of kind of that seeking and that kind of total like emptiness that he has his conversion experience, his transformative experience, which is kind of a mystical experience as well, just like Ignatius had some mystical experiences that he describes. So does George Fox. So there's some similarities there. Yeah.
Friends in the back?
I enjoyed very much your presentation, and I would like to share a personal experience. My older brother was in a diocesan seminary from the age of 14 to 18, and during that time, he was struggling with whether to become a Quaker or to join the Jesuits. So this really struck home to me, and I so enjoyed your sharing of your cultural aspects of the caste system, because that, of course, didn't apply here in the States. So my older brother decided in the end that he would become a Jesuit, and he went to the seminary in Milford, Ohio. And one of the things that my family found somewhat difficult was that he was never again allowed to return home. He had to renounce family completely. I mean, he was in touch with us, but he would not come back to the house. And when we wanted to visit with him, we would go to Milford, Ohio, and visit with him in the seminary. And he would wear a cassock, and he wouldn't leave the grounds with us. And in order to support us, the Jesuits had a group called Jesuit Mothers. And my mother was active in Jesuit Mothers all of her life. And it's just been beautiful being in this group today and hearing your experience and fondly remembering my older brother. I mean, this has just been marvelous. Thank you so very much. Where do I get this?
Did you want to respond to that? Okay. Yeah.
Daniel, to one of Daniel's earlier questions, whether things have changed over the years. One of them is the policy of home visit. When I joined the Jesuits in 1991, we had the policy we could only go back home once in 3 years. But now it has been changed and then said every year you go, because the family tie is as important for your faith and ministry as any other thing. So things do change, and I'm sorry that what happened at that time that you could.
If my brother was still living, he would be in his 80s now. So that gives you the time reference. And none of us in the family, nor he, ever regretted it. As far as it was an adjustment at first. But I mean, as time went on, there were no regrets. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank
It
you.
was a beautiful experience for the whole family.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm Richard Evans, and I'm visiting here from West Hills, France. And so I have quite a history to this church, going way back to First Friends, 1955. And so there's been quite an evolution of Quakerism from that time to today. And it's some of it's been troubling for me, and some of it hasn't been, but I wanted, there's a lot of things that on my mind here. I was wondering if any of you have read the book Hildegard of Bingen, the saint for the 21st century. It's a 12th century nun that has covered some of the issues of the Catholic faith, and I'd recommend that you read that, because that brings us forward to the reality of where we're at today. And I'm troubled. I've always loved the Jesuit folks, but I've had a relationship with people that have been educated in the Jesuit tradition, and I have, I don't know, 8 or 10 friends that went to Xavier and other institutions, and they've left the faith completely. And that's troubling. And, I read that we have a population now of folks that, I don't know, 30 or 40% of them are nuns, N-O-N-E-S, but yet they have a spiritual tradition. They claim to have a spirituality. I'm kind of curious why or how we, the church doesn't address this. In 1955, when I went into the Friends Church, we had a young married group of like 30 or 40 couples, and now we don't even see these folks anymore in the meetings. So, as spiritual leaders, and, we sit around a bunch of old people. Why?
Well, I suppose that's a sort of elephant in the room question for all of us. And so let's turn that into a question. Both the Catholic and the Protestant traditions are seeing difficulties, particularly in the West. Carole, you're here. Dominic, you're in Italy. What are our thoughts now in reflection to that? That, of course, is a 3-hour discussion, but curious as to your thoughts about that.
In the recent general congregation, once in 10 or 15 years, the Jesuits come together and then discuss the most burning issues and how we can adapt our ministries accordingly. And one of the 5 priorities that they have listed is youth. And they are very clear, they are very much aware that in the old style, we are in the church and we expect them to come for the Sunday service, and afterwards our way of practicing the faith, probably we are looking for the repeating the old model, and the youth are saying, well, our interests are elsewhere. If that is the case, can we, or are we bold enough to rethink of our faith life in a different way? Can we reach out to them rather than waiting for them to come to our church? This is the big question that they are asking. And one of the things that they have found is worship is just only one part of it. Can we think of other means of coming together where we share causes even with people who don't believe in. And that is where the World Youth Day, you see thousands, if not millions, are just congregating there, because these are people, youth, for them, the issues of today are burning issues. They share that interest. But if you ask them to come to the church for a Sunday Mass for a half an hour homily, they say, we have other things to do. So kind of thinking outside the box is needed, for both for the people inside and for the people outside.
You have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just wondered, can you be, if people are coming for other reasons rather than spirituality, is there a bridge between their experiences and their desires and that link to spirituality? Or are we just doing something different now?
Thank you. Here I could use what the Ignatian, kind of an old adage. It might sound even little utilitarian, but going through the other's door and coming out of your door is the expression he has coined. If youth are willing to come here for a game, let's say baseball game, in India it will be volleyball game. So the parish priest is making arrangements so that youth come there and then just play. They are not forced to attend the Sunday service or any of those things. But what happens is, in the mere fact they are coming there and then just interacting there, slowly the ice breaks. And there is a truck coming there, and then they are going to decorate, let us say, the Christmas thing. And then one or two of them just come in and join. And I have seen in some parishes it makes a difference. But does it make a big difference that we all would love to or long for? No.
Obviously, Quakers have the same issue. As Dick said, that this used to be a church of 200 people, and now it's down to about 50 or so. And there are these nuns, these spiritual but not religious folks. But in the Quaker tradition, we've always felt that there is that light in everyone. So even within, these folks, they're not in church. They're really kind of against the institutional church, but they're not even against Jesus or God. Some of them really admire Jesus and are very spiritual in that sense. So I think we have to be careful how we judge the nuns, not seeing them as the really irreligious, but they do have a deep spirituality. And we were hoping here at Reedwood that we could maybe attract some of these folks, because we do share similar values. I mean, our spices are values that are shared by many, many people. They're not unique to Quakers. Maybe the acronym is, but there are values such as equality and peace and simplicity. And I mean, all of these values are such that are shared by other people. And in the Quaker tradition, we've always had this kind of feeling of universalism, that there are people that can know God even if they haven't heard of the Bible, even if they haven't read the scripture, that there is this sense of knowing God that's part of the experiential faith. So it seems that we could be open to folks who aren't necessarily religious, but they might have other ways of being church. And I know you've thought about this a lot, Daniel, having some kind of alternative service for these folks, the younger folks. And maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Sister, that's a long conversation. I think one of the values of sitting down together in contexts like this, where we're sharing across traditions, is this recognition that we're all asking very similar questions, and that some of the reasons that we didn't talk to each other in previous generations seem kind of silly now, especially when there's so much to share with each other. We are friends at the top of the hour, and I want to express profound gratitude to all of you for being here. I want to express profound gratitude for this place, and what it has meant to all of us, what it has meant to me and to my family and the Friends tradition. But I also want to express, in the presence of my brother and my friend, my profound gratitude to what I have learned and experienced from the Jesuits. That has been a wonderful 35-year journey. And I often am introduced in Catholic contexts. And when it's clarified that Daniel is a Quaker, and they say, "You're teaching at a Catholic school?" And I said, "Yes." "And which one?" And I say, "Loyola Marymount," and they roll their eyes. "Oh, the Jesuits." As if, well, that explains that. So as you can imagine, that has been a wonderful journey. Thank you so much. Come and greet our panel members. And I want to thank Carole and Dominic both for joining us today. Friends, have a wonderful week.